Welcome to the African Weekly Roundup, a weekly program every Sunday here on HORUFADHI Media, where I discuss the latest news and events across the African continent. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you are currently watching this program, and you can find other exclusive programs, such as Behind the Scenes and Mahahir Salah, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment now. Let's get straight into the news. We begin with our top story in the Horn of Africa, where fighting between Ethiopia's Somali state forces alongside Ethiopian federal troops and Al-Shabab fighters in the border regions between Bakol, Hiran and Afder has currently entered its second week. It was on the 20th of July when Al-Shabab militants shut down telephone networks in the Bakol region of Somalia's southwest state before conducting a surprise attack on the Somali towns of Ato, Yid and the village of Washaqo. Strategically, these towns are located on the border region between Somalia's southwest state and Afder, which is located in the disputed Ogaden region, which resulted in engagement with Liu's special forces of the Ethiopian Somali state. Now, Al-Shabab amassed about 500 fighters, including many who originate from Ethiopia's Somali and Oromia regions, according to intelligence reports. Now, Somali officials and intelligence officers now believe that Al-Shabab's attack on the towns and villages was simply a diversion or distraction from the main attack to cross into Afder along the disputed border between Somalia and Ethiopia. Now, officials from both sides of the border confirmed that the attacks preoccupied Liu police forces and distracted them as other heavily armed Al-Shabab units crossed the border unopposed. Muhammad Abdi Tal, the governor of Bakol, the Somali region from where Al-Shabab launched the attack, told media outlets that the militants who crossed the border did not participate in the attacks in the towns and villages aforementioned. Now, Tal said the unit that entered through Ato was confronted and surrounded by Liu police but made it through despite losing most of their vehicles. He explained a second Al-Shabab unit that crossed the border from another front just east of the region essentially attempted a pincer movement with this second incursion. Now, a look at the timeline. On Monday the 26th of July, Al-Shabab fighters clashed with Liu forces in Las Quron village near the border town of Fair in Ethiopia's Somali state at a disputed border region. Now, US military assessment suggests that the militants have penetrated as much as 150 kilometers into the Somali state before being stopped by Liu police. Now, speaking to the media, one of the witnesses said the militant fighters began their attacks using car bombs and mortar shells, then used guns as they fought the opposing forces. At the time of the attack, members of Somali parliament were in the town to distribute food aid sent from Mogadishu to drought-affected residents. It was not clear if the government delegation was the target of the Al-Shabab attack. Now, the Somali region of Ethiopia said the operation against Al-Shabab fighters who entered the region on July 20th resulted in the killing of more than 100 militants and destruction of 13 vehicles. Now, the Regional Security Council said militants were encircled in the Hulul village area. However, fighting would be reignited on Friday of this week when another battle unfolded in the border town of Ato between Al-Shabab fighters and Liu Special Police Force of the Somali state. Now, officials in Ethiopia's Somali state have claimed up to 170 militants were killed in this battle, including 3 senior Al-Shabab commanders following the airstrike. Now, the head of the Ethiopian National Defense Force Deployment Department, Major General Tasfaye Yalu, confirmed to the media that the following senior commanders were killed: Fuad Mohammed Khalif, who was Al-Shabab's operation chief; Abdul Aziz Abu Mas'ud, who was Al-Shabab's spokesman; and Ubaida Noor Isa, who was the commander of Al-Shabab's operation in Ethiopia and the Bakol region of southwest state Somalia. Now, Fuad Mohammed Khalif was wanted by the US and had a $5 million bounty for his whereabouts. Now, conversely, Al-Shabab have claimed to have killed dozens of Liu police as well as overrunning a forward operating base, or a FOB. They also claim to have captured members of Liu as prisoners of war in pictures that they circulate on their group's social media and website pages. Now, following the battles, Ethiopia has expressed an interest in setting a buffer zone within Somalia. However, Mogadishu has not commented on the matter. However, Somali Prime Minister Hamza Abdi Barre has condemned the attacks and has called on support for the region, putting security forces on high alert. Now, moving on to other news, a new Cold War seems to be operating in Africa as European and Western powers compete for support from African nations. Russian, French and American leaders have crisscrossed across Africa in an attempt to foster support for their positions on the war in Ukraine, waging what some say is the most intense competition for influence on the African continent since the Cold War. Now, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and French President Emmanuel Macron each visited several African countries this week. Samantha Power, head of the US Agency for International Development, or USAID, went to Kenya and Somalia last week, and the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, will be going to Ghana and Uganda next week. In August. Additionally to all these visits, the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken will travel next month to South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda, according to the State Department. This comes as Washington ramps up diplomacy in Africa to counter what it calls a Russian charm offensive. Now, conversely, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov toured major African nations, including Egypt, similarly the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and Uganda, as Moscow similarly aims to strengthen ties with the continent that has refused to join Western condemnation and sanctions over Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Russia is pushing a narrative that the spiraling global food prices are a direct consequence of Western sanctions, an idea rejected by Washington, which instead points to Moscow's blockade of Ukrainian ports. Now, Russia has continuously enjoyed support from Africa, as the Soviet Union played a key part in Africa's struggle against colonialism throughout the latter decades of the 20th century. For example, South Africa, a leader in the developing world, has emerged as a key diplomatic battleground, as it has remained steadfastly neutral on the Ukrainian war, refusing to join Western calls to condemn Moscow, which still enjoys affection for the Soviet Union's historical opposition to apartheid. Now, before Russia's February invasion of Ukraine, US efforts in Africa had a heavy subtext on competition with China, which was pouring in tons of money into infrastructure building on the continent, and contrast itself with the US by making no demands on democracy or human rights in these countries. Now, while the Biden administration has identified China as the primary long-term competitor for the US, in Africa, it has focused on the short term in countering Russian influence in the region. Now, Western nations have overwhelmingly voiced outrage and sought to punish Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine, but developing nations in Africa especially, and South Asia, have been very, very hesitant, as Russia and the United States compete for Africa. In terms of influence, France has renewed its efforts in the African continent, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron traveled to 3 major West African countries, including Cameroon, Benin, and Guinea-Bissau. Now, West Africa is a region that France has a major influence, as most of the region was formerly a French colony under the French West Africa, and most of these countries have French as a main language. And the French are attempting to regain support after facing major political backlash in West Africa, particularly in Mali, where French troops were expelled recently, as well as other regions including Burkina Faso, where recent protests rocked the capital against the presence of French troops. Currently, Nigeria remains the only French military stronghold in the region. Now, interestingly, all 3 powers have expressed support for Africa. For instance, Mr. Lavrov said Russia supported and would continue to support for a permanent seat for Africa at the US Security Council, a position that the African Union highly supports. Now, Macron has also pledged support via France's new so-called farm initiative, with which France and its allies pledged to help developing countries boost their own agricultural capacity, as well as renewed military support for countries in West Africa and the Sahel region. And finally, France's military presence in Mali, for instance, and other African countries have faced local protests and accusations, partially fueled by Russian allegations that France is perpetuating another form of colonial rule. France itself has accused Russia of meddling in West Africa through a group known as the Wagner Group. However, Russian government has denied its ties with the private military group, and it has stressed that the security failures by Western countries in Africa has prompted these governments to seek alternative private partners. Now, staying in West Africa and over to Senegal, where parliamentary elections kick off across the country. Now, the parliamentary elections are a strong indicator of the presidential election outcome, which is expected to take place in 2024, in just over 2 years' time. The opposition hopes this will force a coalition with President Macky Sall and curb any ambitions he may hold for a 3rd term. Now, President Sall was first elected as president in 2012 for 7 years, before being re-elected in 2019 for another 5 years. The opposition have accused the president of wanting to break the 2-term limit and run again in 2024. However, Sall has remained very vague on the subject, promising the public a statement on Monday following elections going on today. Approximately 7 million voters are eligible to elect 165 deputies in the National Assembly. Violent protests broke out last year after Sall's main opponent, Sonko, was arrested on rape charges and more than a dozen people were killed. Now, Sonko, who came 3rd in the 2019 election, denied the allegations, and his supporters have been vocal about the opposition to the president. This year, he and another of Sall's key opponents were disqualified as candidates, which sparked more widespread anger and protests in which 3 people died June of this year. Dissatisfaction with Sall has risen as possible adversaries, including the popular former mayor of Dakar, Khalifa Sall, and former president Abdoulaye Wade's son Karim Wade, have been targeted by the judiciary and disqualified from running for any offices. Now, anger has also grown in the country amid economic worries as fuel and food prices have skyrocketed, directly due to conflict in Ukraine and tensions across the globe. Now, polling stations in the country have opened 8 a.m. this morning and are expected to close at 6 p.m. this evening. Finally, over to Guinea, where protests against the military government and its handling of plans to return to democracy have brought the capital to a standstill, with organizers saying one person was killed. The National Front for the Defense of the Constitution, or FNDC, said one person died after being hit by a bullet and that several others had been injured during the protests on Thursday of this week. The FNDC is an influential political coalition that called for the demonstrations last week to condemn the military's unilateral management of a return to civilian rule after it seized power in 2021. The former ruling Rally for the Guinean People and the National Alliance for Change and Democracy, another coalition of parties and associations, also called on their supporters to join the demonstrations. Now, authorities have previously banned the rally and have not confirmed the death, which has been reported by opposition groups. The public prosecutor on Thursday ordered an immediate legal action against the organizers. Now, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya was sworn in as an interim president last October after leading the coup against former President Condé, whose attempt to extend his hold on power for a third term sparked widespread anger. Now, the colonel, who's the current president of Guinea, said his administration's mission was to refound the state by drafting a new constitution, fighting corruption, reforming the electoral system, and then organizing free, credible, and transparent elections, according to a government spokesman. On Thursday, the West African Regional Bloc ECOWAS chair Umar Sissoko Embalo said he had recently convinced the military to hasten the return to democracy. Speaking alongside French President Emmanuel Macron at a media briefing in Bissau, Guinea-Bissau, president and chairman of ECOWAS said he had recently convinced Guinea's military government to shorten its time. However, a government minister from Guinea and spokesman for the transitional government told AFP that neither the government nor the presidency confirmed this information about the duration of the transition to democracy in Guinea. Now, major coups have toppled governments across West, Central, and East Africa. We've seen that in Mali, and we've seen it in Guinea, and we see it in Sudan, and this have continued over the last number of years. Now, that's all the top stories this week. Tune in next week for another weekly update of events across the African continent.